So next I want to talk about how dietary protein and metabolism all factor into kidney disease and actually result in uremia and retention of uremic solutes. So let's think about dietary protein here. So imagine we just had a large protein diet, and remember, eventually there'll be a lot of amino acids here in our gut. And so among these, tyrosine's one of them, tryptophan's another one. And the microbiome is very active and very important in metabolism. So this is the collection of gut bacteria that we all have in our gastrointestinal system. And so with a special attention to the kidney and uremic solutes, it's important to think about how the microbiome is metabolizing everything we eat. And so in this situation, tyrosine is metabolized by the microbiome, and then p-cresol is absorbed. So tyrosine to p-cresol, and then also the microbiome will convert tryptophan into this chemical indole. And so these are precursors to the following uremic solutes. So p-cresol is converted to p-cresol sulfate, which is metabolized by the liver, and then indole to indoxyl sulfate. Okay, and so these are uremic solutes. But when everything is working normally, as long as we have good kidney function, both of these can go to the kidney, get filtered, and excreted in the urine. Next, remember that amino acids get metabolized, and we can import amino acids into the TCA cycle to get energy, but one consequence of that is ammonogenesis. We make ammonia, remember, so amino acids, they all have sort of ammonia in it, and so as part of amino acid metabolism, we'll generate ammonia, and that's another toxic substance we have to deal with. And so the liver has the urea cycle, which is essentially taking up ammonia to generate urea, which can then be excreted by the kidney. But remember, here we have dietary protein, so that will contribute to circulating amino acids, and then also muscle breakdown can generate free amino acids. And keep in mind, chronic metabolic acidosis, as would be seen with chronic kidney disease, is associated with muscle wasting, protein degradation, and release of amino acids from muscle. So here we are generating amino acids, and also in the kidney, glutamine, as you remember, is broken down, and as it's metabolized, it generates ammonia as well. So the ammonogenesis takes place in the kidney. The kidney does this for a number of reasons. It also generates ammonium to help with hydrogen trapping, but we have to have a way to deal with the ammonia, and because this is toxic, and amino acids and ammonia will feed into the urea cycle, and this will help generate urea. As we all know, urea is one of the uremic toxins, and as long as urea is excreted by the kidney, it won't build up to significant concentrations. But in the setting of chronic kidney disease or end-stage kidney disease, urea builds up and results in side effects. So in essence, we need the kidney to excrete urea, p-cresol sulfate, indoxyl sulfate, and all sorts of other compounds that are part of the uremic solutes that are retained. And I just picked a few that were representative of uremic solutes. But when these build up, this is when patients develop the uremic syndrome. And so the symptoms of uremia are pretty wide, and individually they're pretty nonspecific. I mean, fatigue, peripheral neuropathy, decreased mental acuity. If it gets severe enough, some people have seizures. Many patients have chronic nausea. They lose their appetite, or anorexia. They have a diminished sense of smell, funny taste in their mouth, like metallic taste, leg cramps, sleep disturbances, reduced body temperature, many other problems. Itching and hiccups have been reported. But what we are also worried about is all these solutes, as they accumulate, causes increased reactive oxygen species and endothelial dysfunction, and then eventually bad cardiovascular outcomes. And so there are many different solutes that are retained and involved in the uremic syndrome. That's probably why we see so many different symptoms, but underlying all this is metabolism, so amino acid metabolism, protein metabolism, the microbiome, and then our kidneys' inability to excrete these products. And this is what is essentially driving uremia. Now, just to summarize some concepts from a few of the other videos, is that with the dietary protein intake, we're adding a number of things to our body. So we're going to generate more urea, nitrogenous wastes, and uremic solutes. Also, there's a lot of phosphorus in dietary protein, so we're going to add a higher phosphate load to the body. And then also with a dietary protein intake, we're going to generate more of that non-volatile acid that's going to get buffered and contribute to the metabolic acidosis of CKD. So as you can imagine, if you have advanced CKD, a diet high in protein is probably going to generate more metabolic problems, probably more azotemia, higher phosphate loads, and more acidosis. So you may be wondering, what's the recommended dietary protein intake, and what's the recommended diet for a patient who has CKD? So it does appear that a modest protein restriction is beneficial. So the goal, at least for patients with a moderate to severe chronic kidney disease, that's patients with the estimated GFR less than 45, or patients with proteinuria. Let's say they have greater than 300 milligrams of protein in their urine per day. So the goal is dietary protein intake of 0.6 to 0.8 grams per kilo per day. And so there have been some association studies that showed, high intake of red meat or processed meat in the diet was associated with increased risk for kidney disease. And then, a diet richer in, dairy, protein, nuts, and beans had the lower risk. And so, this kind of makes sense, just that, the more protein you take in, we're going to generate more nitrogenous wastes. Restricting protein may lessen the onset of uremic symptoms. We don't have a lot of studies showing that it, delays dialysis initiation and things like that, but we do know that the metabolic profile will be improved. So the way I think about using this is that it's not uncommon to identify patients who have a very high protein intake, specifically of animal protein sources. And so I may talk to them about cutting back on how much they're ingesting, and, using this sort of estimate, let's say a 70 kilogram person, maybe we're looking at about, 50 grams of protein per day. And so maybe looking at charts to try and gauge how much protein they're taking in. And I would try and encourage, high biologic value proteins like, eggs or dairy products or soybeans or plant-based proteins instead of, processed meats or red meat, which can contain a lot of sodium and inorganic phosphate and other things that are going to upset other parameters of CKD. So this is one way to approach it. One other thing that's been found is that actually the low protein diet is actually sort of ameliorated proteinuria and glomerular hyperfiltration, which is kind of interesting. So experimental evidence does suggest that long-term high dietary protein intake actually leads to glomerular hyperfiltration and sort of a pro-inflammatory expression of genes. And so here we are looking at a glomerulus, and so a high protein diet does apparently lead to dilation of the afferent arteriole. So here's the afferent arteriole, and so this will dilate. Okay, so as this dilates, we're increasing pressure into the glomerulus. So here we'll increase PGC, so increase the intraglomerular pressure. So as a result of chronic glomerular hyperfiltration, actually there's increased mesangial cell signaling that leads to high levels of TGF-beta, which is this pro-inflammatory, pro-fibrotic signal. And basically this can lead to subsequent progressive fibrosis and renal damage. And so, maybe in the short term, it kind of makes sense that the kidney would want to boost GFR with protein intake if maybe there's a signal that you have to handle more solute. But chronic, ingestion of a high protein diet and chronic glomerular hyperfiltration is not good, and we know it's not good for these reasons. So we actually want to reduce glomerular pressures if possible. And so glomerular hypertension is something we try and avoid. And so it does appear that a protein diet, a very high protein diet, actually will increase the GFR, increase glomerular pressures, but in the long run that is bad, mainly due to these signaling pathways and development of renal fibrosis. So here we are on the right looking at a kidney and a glomerulus with a low protein diet. So as you can see, with a low protein diet, we do not have excessive vasodilation of the afferent arteriole, right? So it's back to normal size. Therefore, the pressure in the glomerular capillaries are normal, so they're not excessively high. This leads to decrease in mesangial cell signaling and thus decreased levels of TGF-beta. So we would recommend using this as one method to decrease glomerular hyperfiltration and decrease the amount of chronic signaling that could lead to renal fibrosis. So in light of this fact that a high protein diet can cause glomerular hyperfiltration, who else could benefit from such a dietary protein restriction? Well, I mean, think about any patient with one kidney, so either status post-nephrectomy for renal cell cancer, any other reason, congenital solitary kidney, or even a patient who donated their kidney to someone. They may benefit from a low protein diet lifelong. Or patients with diabetes and diabetic nephropathy who are already having a glomerular hyperfiltration, this could help ameliorate that. Patients with polycystic kidney disease, and really any patient with proteinuria. Remember, this is why we use ACE inhibitor and ARB therapy. We're trying to reduce glomerular hypertension, reduce the pressures, and a low protein diet will also ameliorate proteinuria independent of the angiotensin pathway modulation. So this sort of protein restriction could sort of piggyback on top of a RAS blockade therapy to try and reduce proteinuria, slow the progression of CKD, and keep patients with CKD, living longer and progressing to dialysis more slowly. So consider bringing this up with your patients as well.